Welcome back to Vote for Vermont. I am Ben Kinsley. I'm going to be today's host, and we have a returning guest, Robin Chesnut-Tangerman, who is the head of the House Progressive Caucus. Robin, thank you for coming back and joining us.
Thank you for having me back on, Ben.
You know, and we talked to you back at the beginning of the legislative session, kind of about your goals leading into 2017 and what you were looking forward to and what things you were going to be working on. So we invited you back to kind of get your take on how the session went. But before we jump into that, could you just give us a brief overview of your background for our viewers? And you have a really interesting history, like not a very typical political background at all. So I'm sure they'd like to hear more about that.
Thank you. It's true. I didn't expect to be a legislator or be in politics. I represent a district in southwestern Rutland County, 4 towns in Rutland County, 1 in Bennington County. It's a very rural area, and I would say evenly mixed in terms of left-right political leanings. My own background is I've been a self-employed contractor for 25 years with a focus on renewable energy and energy efficiency. Also an educator and a father. Husband.
Which is probably the toughest job, right?
Is the most important job.
The most important
for sure.
one. Yeah. Well, there's some great stuff going on in the state around energy efficiency and, Efficiency Vermont, which is kind of a unique model as opposed to other states. So
it is. It's getting a lot of interest around the state.
Exactly. It's some cool stuff going on.
I mean around the country.
Around the country as, as a model. Particularly as like this new accord that these states are working on in response to the Paris climate
Which I was
agreement.
really pleased to see Vermont step right up to the plate. I give the governor kudos for that.
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of hesitation there.
No.
He stepped right up and was like, we're going to do this. And I know one of our next door neighbors here, Charlie Baker in Massachusetts also, and there's a number of governors across the country that are really kind of stepping it up and saying if the federal government's not going to take this on, then we are. So
and I see that the states have been joined by a number of major corporations and also native tribes.
Yes.
Standing Rock Sioux.
Yep.
To name one, but there are a number of tribes that have also asked to participate in their own right.
Well, it's an important issue, and it's one that up until now, at least, the United States has been a leader on. Hopefully, states will continue to step up and carry the baton, even if the federal government doesn't.
Yes, and I think people don't often give Vermont enough credit. I think that in terms of energy, progressive energy regulation and legislation. California certainly is the 800-pound gorilla because they have such a large and vibrant economy, and what they do matters in economic terms. But what Vermont does matters in moral terms.
Right.
States look to Vermont. Oh, what are they doing? Not that our economy will determine what they do, but for a model of what's possible.
Right. Well, and Vermont is in a unique position of being almost carbon neutral. I think our net is about 50 million tons of carbon a year, and most of that,
is from transportation.
Is from transportation.
Right.
Yeah. So we're really are, compared to most other states, a leader. I think the only state in the country that is net neutral is Alaska, and that's partially because of the forest land that they have.
Right.
It's just so massive relative to their population.
And one thing that I'm very interested in looking at next year, and I know this is jumping ahead some, but is looking at ways that we can expand the good work that Efficiency Vermont is doing in a way that can start to address thermal efficiency and transportation efficiency.
Yeah, we had Robert Ide on a few weeks ago, who's the head of the Vermont DMV, and we had talked a little bit about how we can start chipping away at that transportation piece of it, because that almost half of our carbon emissions in Vermont are transportation.
And it's tough in a rural state where we take our ability to drive somewhere as a God-given right.
Right, right, exactly.
None of us want to give that up.
Well, and it also makes public transportation difficult if you don't have large numbers of people that are going in similar patterns.
Yep.
So there's certainly some challenges there.
One thing that came up during this legislative session that will help with this is the Volkswagen settlement money.
Right.
Where the state will have a total of almost $22 million.
That hopefully can reinvest into some of these programs.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's some
jumpstart
interesting.
the mass transit infrastructure with low emissions vehicles.
Right, and low emissions nowadays, there are plenty of even internal combustion engines that are moving towards better efficiency.
Right.
You know, that still have a number of technologies that are still developing in that area. It's not just electric anymore. It's not just, you know, hydrogen or, you know, the next
Right.
thing. There's a number of different technologies out there that can work together.
And with the rapid progression in battery storage,
Exactly.
you know,
Which,
not only does that herald big changes for the viability of electric vehicles, but for the grid, reshaping the grid and the role renewables play in the grid.
Tesla
entirely.
has been a leader in that in both
Exactly.
regards.
Yeah.
So try not to get sidetracked too much, but I want to get your take on the 2017 legislative session as the first half of the biennium. And for our viewers watching at home, a biennium is 2 years of a legislative session. So when a representative is elected to office, they serve a term for 2 years, and that 2-year term is called the biennium.
Right.
So this was the first half of the biennium this year because we had elections in November. How do you feel like you went, when we talked in January, you listed several priorities for the Progressive Caucus in the House. Among them were human rights, you know, where all Vermonters can live a quality of life and dignity of work, livable wage, affordable and accessible health care, and affordable child care. Do you feel like you were successful in achieving some of those initiatives, and where you weren't maybe as successful as you were hoping to be, were you able to set the stage for next year, the next half of the biennium?
Well, actually, it's interesting, Ben, that those are defined as progressive values, because I just view them as human values.
Right.
You know, that's what we all want, right? We all want affordable, accessible health care. We all want to be able to afford high quality, appropriate child care for our kids. We all want a quality of life. We want a job with meaning. We want a livable wage.
You know, it's amazing because when we did that first show where we had all the leaders of the caucuses in the House come and talk about their priorities for the session, we found the priorities were basically the same between all of them.
It's how you get there.
It's how you get there, right?
Exactly.
That's where the I guess the difference is between the parties is, you know, everyone's got the same goal, but how do you achieve those goals? So how do you feel like 2017 and this legislative session went for you guys?
I think we made some progress. Cautious optimism.
Cautious, yes.
Certainly with the passage of things like the family leave bill. Mm-hmm. Although, you know, it's a small step in that it only covers employees in Vermont. You know, there are a lot of Vermonters who are self-employed.
Right.
It's a state of self-employed small businesses.
Exactly.
And so it doesn't include everyone that it needs to, but it starts the ball rolling. It's a framework that we can build on.
And it's fairly limited also compared to some other states and what they've done. It only covers, my understanding, paid family leave for a family member, not necessarily for the worker themselves.
Right.
And so it's not a full benefit package that some other states have done.
Right. But it's not necessarily a disability leave. It's
Correct,
to
yeah.
care for an aging parent or a sick child, or Pat's husband with his back issues right now.
Right.
You know, those sort of unexpected emergencies that we all deal with, and this provides a means for people to do that without having to choose between caring for a family member and necessarily putting food on the table.
And this program is an employee-funded program. It comes off of basically your W-4 tax filings.
Yeah.
And it's quite affordable when you look at the
very
program.
small percentage.
Very small percentage. I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's like a couple tenths of a 1%.
I want to say 1.141%, something.
Yeah, that sounds about
I'm
right.
not guaranteeing that number, but
Yeah, a fraction of a percentage.
yes.
You're talking a couple pennies off of
Right.
each paycheck to help.
Very, very affordable.
Very, very affordable. Very similar to disability insurance and unemployment insurance that we already have programs that are existing in the state, and we collect it the same way. So I think.
And again, all of these work by having everyone in.
Right.
So
That's how it's affordable, right?
right.
Yeah.
Which is another reason to get everybody in on this.
Yep.
Including those of us who are self-employed. Another highlight that I would say the session started off with a bang by the state's response to President Trump's travel ban.
That's right. Yeah.
And what we saw was a unified response, largely unified response, saying that the state will not participate in registries based on religion or race, that the federal government can't deputize Vermont law enforcement without the governor's review and permission. These, I thought, were very positive steps, drawing together to make a strong statement on who we are as Vermonters and what our principles are.
Well, and it was, I think, a great example of a tripartisan effort that was unified both the legislative and executive branch in a very quick response. It was very quick.
If only we were there now.
Right, right. And I think the governor is very forceful on the fact that the law enforcement officers in the state should not be deputized by the federal government, and I think that's an important thing. We've seen that. It's a states' rights issue, is what it comes down to in many ways, and it's also a human rights issue.
And which is not to in any way belittle the ongoing cooperation between state and federal law enforcement, which is extensive.
Of course.
And valuable to both. It's just drawing a line saying, yeah, we're cooperating well up to here. After this point, we need to look at it a little more closely.
Right, and there's a certain point beyond which we don't share maybe the same values, or we don't want to go as far as maybe the federal government does in certain areas. One other one on this list that that kind of draws my attention is the livable wage piece of that. There was a pretty strong effort this year to move forward on a minimum wage increase bill that did not make it to the finish line this year, but it definitely started a conversation, and it looks like it's going to be coming back next year. So was that a bill that your caucus supported? Did you feel like it didn't go far enough, or there were other changes that you wanted to see?
We did support it very strongly, recognizing that there are a lot of challenges inherent in that. Going from $10 in January, the minimum wage in Vermont will go to $10.50.
Right.
But there's a world of difference between $10.50 and $15.
Right.
And I don't think that the question is even really whether $15 is appropriate. It's not technically a livable wage in Vermont with housing costs so high and transportation costs so high. But so it's how do we get there?
Right.
In a way that is not ruinous to self-employed people, small business owners. And I think what we need there is creative cooperation rather than an antagonistic.
Right. Well, it's interesting because one of the points I've made to some people who have already argued against a $15 minimum wage is that we're going to get there eventually, because for the viewers at home that may not know this, Vermont has a minimum wage that increases every year based on inflationary amounts. So we will get to $15 at some point, but it may be like 2030. So I think the point that you're trying to make is we want to get there sooner than that.
We want to get there sooner when in real dollars it's not the same as it is now. It should be an advance in standard of living for people.
Yeah.
And again, when we say we all have the same goals, our approaches differ. We all share the goal of a more robust economy in Vermont. And for me, how do you have a robust economy? What does that mean? It means money in people's pockets.
Yeah.
And this is the most direct way to do that.
And I do think actually that the way the Vermont system is set up for minimum wage is a good system because it has that cost of living increase built into it.
Right.
And that's one of the big criticisms of the federal minimum wage is that I think the last time that it was adjusted was 1970 something.
It's still stuck at
And
$7.25.
And $7.25 was the rate that they set then, but inflationary amounts have gone up significantly since then. So in real dollars, that minimum wage has actually gone down over the last 30 or 40
Substantially.
years. Substantially.
Yes.
As opposed to keeping pace with inflation, and which is really what matters is your buying power.
And also what's happened in that 30 years or longer is the nature of who is taking those minimum wage jobs. I think it used to be that there were more teenagers doing the minimum wage jobs, summer jobs, sort of the expendable employees.
Right.
Now those jobs are increasingly taken by people, retirees, or people with lower education degrees.
They get stuck in those types of roles.
They get stuck in those jobs, but yet they are the main breadwinner for the family. It's not, discretionary income
Right.
for a teenager. It's food and rent for a family struggling.
And that's an important context, I think, for that whole debate. Is it's not the typical entry-level jobs that we're thinking of,
Right.
that traditionally we think of anymore. It is career jobs that are getting stuck in that band of maybe at or slightly above minimum wage, but you're not really making as much as other occupations you
Right.
could be making.
And that's the definition of a dead-end job.
Right. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a number of changes in leadership this year.
If I can just go back to
Sure,
one of the
yeah.
other things you mentioned was healthcare.
Yeah.
And of course, we're still miles away from any kind of really inclusive, affordable health care. And by that, I'm referring to single payer.
Right.
An everybody in format. But I think we did make some good progress in mental health this year. Finally putting mental health on parity with physical health. And also particularly with the bill that provided workman's comp for PTSD for first responders.
I think both those bills were critical, and I think also putting mental health, as you mentioned, on the same level as other types of health care is important moving forward, because it's been stigmatized for so long, mental
Right.
health care, and there was a significant effort that came out of the Senate this year that really, I think, moved that issue forward.
And I think in moving, as you said, moving those conversations out of the shadows so they're no longer stigmatized, mental health and drug addiction.
Yeah.
Both of
Yep.
those, if we can look at them directly instead of in the shadows, that's when we'll begin to make progress.
And I think Governor Shumlin did a lot of work there, particularly with drug addiction and moving that out of the shadows, and
Yes.
even sparked a national conversation around it.
Yep.
Whether he intended to do so or
It's
not,
Perhaps not in the way he intended.
Right.
But,
Yes.
but it's it's difficult to do that. It's difficult to change those moral, those societal mores about addiction is shameful and mental illness is shameful. It's a slow process to have honest discussions about those.
Well, and it takes time to change societal perceptions, and it takes a lot of openness and public discussion about difficult topics in order to change people's opinions of them and change the opinions of society as a whole. And
Right.
so I think we've started that conversation, and hopefully it will continue.
Right. So we're not where we want to be, but I feel like we are making progress. We're moving ahead.
Good. So right from the beginning of the session this year, you were dealing with something that's kind of unusual, but it was a recount between Susan Hatch Davis and Bob Frenier. And the primary concern really was about absentee ballots that were treated and the process itself and how it was handled in this recount proceeding. There was 2 recounts with a third one that the legislature was trying to carry out. There's a great quote, and everyone probably knows at this point that the recount from the House was called off. There's a great quote from you back in January about it, the irony of a process that was meant to correct a mistake in a process was derailed by a process.
A mistake in a process.
A mistake in a process,
Right.
which I thought was a great quote. But can you talk a little bit about that situation and kind of your perspective on it?
Yeah, I would say at that point, brand new Progressive Caucus chair in the House, my first job was to stand up and object to Representative Frenier being seated before the process had played out, the appeal had played out its course, which was purely a procedural objection, not a personal objection, which he understood.
Right.
And without getting into the details of it too much, there were a number of very close races this year which involved recounts, all of which were conducted a little bit differently.
Yeah. Yep.
And in Susan Hatch Davis's recount, one of the major issues, as you mentioned, was that there were absentee ballots, which had been deemed as I get confused here between spoiled or well, they were invalid because of an error in whether the envelope was sealed or not, that sort of thing, or were there two ballots in one envelope.
Right.
And we felt very strongly that those should be included in a recount. The other side objected to those being looked at, saying they have already been discarded, so let's not bring them back into it. And we felt very strongly that how can you have a recount if you're not looking at all of the ballots?
Right.
And we lost on that point eventually. And those ballots were discarded. They were not going to be considered in the recount, which ultimately was canceled due to a procedural error. But ultimately, and I also want to say that I was both surprised and disappointed at the bitter partisanship that came out in that.
Yeah, there was a lot of people on both sides that were that had very harsh words to say.
Yes,
Yeah.
there were. But I feel ultimately that our position was vindicated in that the end result of this, even though the recount itself didn't happen and Representative Frenier was seated, which he may have been even had the recount gone forward.
Right.
I'm not projecting an outcome either way. But the ultimate end result of this was a tripartisan election reform bill coming about because of the highlighted need for clarity in how recounts are conducted uniformly.
Well, I think, when you have recounts that were so close as some of them were this year. I mean, there was one election, one race this year that was decided by one vote.
Which actually flipped.
Right. And when you have elections that are being decided by that close of a margin, you have to have really strong confidence in the procedure of both the election itself and any recount.
Absolutely.
And so I think it is a positive outcome, even though there was this divide over this one particular race. I think that the end result is probably a positive one in that there's now a better process, or hopefully a better process in place with more clarity about how to deal with these situations in the future. Because again, you're right, like you mentioned, it wasn't the only close race this year.
And I would say that's one where, the progressives, we stuck to our guns. We didn't win a lot of friends, but we made our point, and I believe that ultimately we were proven correct in the need for an overhaul of the recount system.
Absolutely. So we've only got a few minutes left, but I do want to talk a little bit about the governor's budget that he proposed in January, and basically a very similar budget was then passed by the House with near unanimous support. There was only one House member that voted against it, which is almost unheard of that you see a budget passed by that overwhelming of a margin.
And it was actually one dissenting vote in the entire legislature because the Senate passed it unanimously.
Senate also passed it unanimously. So can you speak a little bit to the budget and why you think it got so much support across party lines?
I would say that a lot of support for it was less for what was actually in the budget itself, because it was something of an austerity budget, in that it met the governor's demand for no new fees or taxes. But the Appropriations Committee worked very, very hard and very openly in soliciting input from every member of the House, regardless of party, independents, Republicans, Democrats, progressives, taking all opinions, filtering them, suggestions, working with committees to see get committee input on their areas of supervision and jurisdiction. And I think the process was a very thorough one, a very fair one, and that's a lot of what we were responding to.
And I think from what I've heard, universally, there's a lot of admiration for that process that the Appropriations Committee went through. They did a lot of work on this budget, and I think they were under pressure from both House leadership potentially, but also an administration that was very clear they were not going to raise taxes or fees, so they had to work within that box. And then we also had this budget pressure from the federal government, not really knowing, whether some of our major funding sources might actually dry up come, the end of the year.
And I think within all of those pressures, that the governor had said he would veto a budget that raised taxes, not knowing what's happening in October when the federal budget passes, and recognition that Vermonters are unhappy with the rate of taxation as it exists now, or at least the distribution of taxation. Let me put it that way.
Right.
I think it was an acceptable job in shaping a budget. Of course, there were things that we didn't necessarily like in it, but with all of those, within those constraints, it was an acceptable budget obviously to virtually all of us, which makes it that much more frustrating that having crafted and approved a budget that met the governor's criteria, he then vetoed it.
Right, which happened just a couple days ago.
Right.
Which now we're headed for a veto session at the end of June here, the 21st and the 22nd.
Mm-hmm.
And center stage is the proposal from the governor about teachers' health care and how we handle healthcare contracts and contract negotiations. There's of course the underlying budget, and then potentially even the marijuana bill might be a topic for discussion. It's not quite clear yet, but it sounds like the legislature is potentially making progress on that front as well.
Right. I think the governor has opened the door for that too.
Yeah. He said he was willing to sign something, but here's the concerns he had with the bill that he was originally sent, and it sounds like they're working on a compromise that may be voted depending on how things work out. But
and actually, a linkage that I would make there is that my frustration is in the governor's timing and approach. This budget that when the legislature passed it, he praised it as within his guidelines and meeting his parameters, and then at the last minute introduced this demand to, as he put it, it's to capture savings that could arise from a change in teachers' health care contracts. His demand was that those negotiations happen at a state level. And for me, I have a number of concerns, but the biggest one is timing. 2 weeks before the end of the session, when there's no time to vet the idea, to really understand the long-term impacts, you don't reach into 90-plus ongoing school negotiations and say, hey guys, we're changing the rules, this is how it's going to be. I don't know whether having a statewide contract is a good idea. I don't know if it's a bad idea because we haven't had time to vet it.
Yeah, it really kind of threw the legislature into a tailspin in a lot of ways. It looked like you were on track to wrap up maybe even a little bit early, and then the governor comes out with this proposal and says, I won't sign the budget unless you take this up.
Right.
It kind of threw everything into a tailspin and pushed the legislative session out 2 weeks, and now we have this veto session.
And I've really felt that the legislature went as far as we could go to addressing his concerns without doing that, reaching into ongoing negotiations and disrupting a collective bargaining process that's been in place for decades.
So any predictions? We only got about a minute left, but any predictions for what you think is going to come out of the veto session at the end of this month?
No. In a word, I'm hoping that we can. What I'm hoping is that we can go ahead and approve a budget that passed 173 to 1.
Which sounds like a reasonable request.
That's how I see it, yes.
Yes. Well, we'll have to have you
And,
back to talk about the 2018 legislative session, maybe later this year or leading up to that. I'm sure there's lots of other interesting things you guys are working on leading into next year, and try to build off of some of the work that you did this year. But thank you very much
Well,
for
thank you, Ben. I
for
would love to
joining
come
us.
back anytime, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the session.
Absolutely. Well, for those of you watching at home, thank you for watching, and please join us next week. Until then, keep listening beyond the sound bites.